Welcome to the Power of Food Forum. I am Noel Didla, a Bahujan woman from Guntur. My birthplace, Guntur, is in the southeastern part of India. Guntur is between the Bay of Bengal, a saltwater body, and the River Krishna, a freshwater body. Guntur is also the Asia's largest chili market. Andhra Pradesh, the name of my state, and it is also known as Annapurna, which means giver of food and nourishment. I am an immigrant making home in Jackson, Mississippi, the ancestral lands of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and the Natchez people. I am proud to represent the Mississippi Food Policy Council, the Mississippi Food Justice Collaborative, and the Mississippi Food Systems Thinkers today. To help us contextualize why we are here, I want us to be grounded by the wisdom of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer. She said, "One day I know the struggle will change. There's gotta be a change not only for Mississippi, not only for the people in the United States, but people all over the world." Thank you, Ms. Hamer, for your wisdom and incredible legacy. In this moment, I also have to acknowledge the transformative work, truths, struggles, and lived experiences of many BIPOC ancestors, elders, contemporaries across generations, and young people that have led us to build this time together. Much gratitude to those that have done and do the cultural work of giving us the words and the language to affirm our mission and lean into the practice of our values. Because of all of them, we are able to unapologetically and courageously articulate that centering racial equity and economic justice is the only way to transform and sustain our economies and our food systems. We can't afford to be under the impression that by ourselves we can save communities or nations. We must build with each other across communities, coalitions, and networks at the speed of trust. And our work must inform and transform us as individuals, our institutions, and our food policy infrastructure. We must invest in building our capacities to have a very clear analysis of power, race, class, gender, and all other forms of oppression that hold us back from being responsible stewards of food systems change. I believe that's why we are gathering.
Thank you, Noel. I'm Karen Bassarab with the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Noel and I are joining you from Baltimore, Maryland, on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. The Center for a Livable Future is a small but mighty research, education, and advocacy center in the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. Through this institution, we are providing backbone support to a growing network of food policy councils. I'm honored to play a role in this network because I get to see the transformative work that is happening across the US, North America, and across the globe in creating local, regional, state, and tribal food systems that are equitable and sustainable. This gathering is momentous. This is the first national gathering of food policy councils, our partners, and allies. This event was informed and shaped by you, along with 25 dedicated people like Noel, that have given their time, their ideas, their creativity. They're coming to us from across the US and from Canada, and they helped to make this event possible. It wasn't easy. It's been 2 years in the making, and we've gone through 2 stops and starts in trying to be together in person. And we are deeply saddened that we're not together in Kansas City. And we are especially grateful to the local host committee that's based in Kansas City for all of their time and the energy that they put into trying to show off their communities and preparing for us. We have a little bit of glimpse of what's happening in Kansas City throughout the forum while you're here with us for the next 2 days. While we have grappled with how to host this event, our struggles have been minor compared to the brunt of the multiple crises that you have been facing in your communities. From the pandemic, from the climate crisis causing wildfires and hurricanes, on top of the 100 years of oppression of Indigenous, Black, Brown, queer, disabled, immigrant, rural, poor white, and non-English speaking communities. We look to this time as a space to build together and to re-energize for action. There are 88 people who will be sharing their experience and expertise and inviting you, along with the 628 other people joining us for the forum, to share your experiences and expertise. We hope that you will take this time to imagine how we together can transform policy.
Thanks, Karen. Our charge for the next couple of days is very straightforward. Mississippi's native son, Kiese Lehman, was asked what Black children deserved from the public education system. His response was, Black children deserved good love, healthy choices, and second chances. I'm asking us to apply that framework to imagine how transformative food systems work deserves to look like in our places and for our people. I'm asking us all to imagine how good love, healthy choices, and second chances look like in Mississippi, Kansas, Hawaii, Montana, New Mexico, Michigan, and every other rural, urban, county, city, tribal nation, and state.
One of the guiding principles for this event is radical hospitality. In planning this event, we work to create an equitable space that invites and welcomes people from all walks of life and listens to their contributions. We particularly want for those that have historically been unseen and unheard to be seen and heard.
And to help us reflect on and practice such a culture of equity and justice, we are joined by Geraldine Dixon and Kim Dixon of Progressive Therapy. Please check the chat and the schedule for when Geraldine and Kim are available as holistic wellness clinicians to support us all during the forum. Thank you both so much.
Thank you. And to make the most of our time together, we have created community agreements and online engagement etiquette. These agreements ask that we listen deeply and without judgment to one another, and that we try to see each other's dignity and humanity. We also ask that you remain as active of a participant as possible, and we know that it can be hard in this virtual space. But this is not a conference. This is a forum of people to share and to build as equals. We ask that you please take a moment to review the agreements and online etiquette. So, to lead us in an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those that were the stewards and keepers of this land before us, I would like to introduce Dr. Alex Redcorn. Alex is a citizen of the Osage Nation. At Kansas State University, he is co-chair of the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance, and he is executive director of the Kansas Association for Native American Education. His scholarship and service are focused on building capacities for Native nations to take on a more prominent role in the education of their citizens. I'm delighted to welcome Alex to not only deliver a land acknowledgement, but also to help us understand why these land acknowledgements are important. So with that, and we also regret that we cannot be in Kansas City with you, Alex, in person, but thank you so much for being here and joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. Hawaii Dahe. My name is Alex Redcorn. I'm a citizen of the Osage Nation. I'm from the Tsijuastage clan, and my family is from the Wahakaline district of the Osage Nation, which is Pawhuska, Oklahoma, for anybody that's been in that area. So, as I said, I'm also an assistant professor of educational leadership at Kansas State University, and I'm the coordinator of Indigenous partnerships, and I'm also the executive director of the Kansas Association for Native American Education. So as they mentioned originally, this gathering was intended to be in person in Kansas City before being moved to this virtual format. So I was asked to do a land acknowledgement of this place, where it was supposed to be, and that happens to be where I'm at right now. So I live in the Kansas City area. So I want to acknowledge that Kansas City resides on the ancestral lands of the Osage Nation. We are on the northern boundaries of where my ancestors thrived for centuries. And some of the roads and highways of Kansas City follow trails blazed and maintained by my ancestors for centuries. We also must acknowledge that we're near the intersection of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, where some of our Degi Hasuan relatives, such as the Omaha and the Kanza people, also have history. But also, we must recognize how the history of westward expansion in the United States brings entangled layers to these land acknowledgements. So on the Kansas side of the metropolitan area, which was also known as Indian Territory at one time, many tribes such as the Wyandot, Shawnee, Delaware, Peoria, Miami, Kaskaskia, Wea, among others, were relocated to reservations in these territories and in this area, before being forcibly removed again, many to Oklahoma, which is where the current Osage Nation resides. And it also just the complexity of settler colonialism and westward expansion. It's important to acknowledge that there are still 4 tribes in Kansas. And I know Kansas City is technically Missouri, but I'm on the Kansas side, so I have to acknowledge those 4 tribes in Kansas, being the Kickapoo tribe of Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomis, the Iowa, and the Sac and Fox. So it's really important to acknowledge these things, and I appreciate this opportunity to be here and acknowledge these histories as you begin your conference focused on the power of food. Because as you all know, land and food are inherently connected. So with this in mind, I was invited here to offer land acknowledgement, but also, as they said, I was invited to say a few words about the act of doing land acknowledgements and why we do such things. So I'd like to offer some context on why these land acknowledgements are important, and particularly why these actions need to be seen as more than a check the box sort of gesture. So it's important to follow through with things as more than just things we check off saying, hey, we did that. So as a reminder, I'm not a food policy expert, but I've studied American Indian perspectives in education, and we need to start the conversation by acknowledging where most people are, not all people, but where most people are with their understanding of American Indians. So in the effort to make this a little bit more interactive, I can't necessarily hear everybody in real time, but I'm going to do a pop quiz, and you won't be graded, so don't worry. And I'm sure some of you people are going to be Googling and cheating in the background, but that's okay. That's kind of what I want people to do. So I'm going to ask a couple questions to start. And my first questions are, how many original colonies were in the United States? And how many states are in the United States? So how many original colonies are in the United States and how many states are in the United States? These are 2 fundamental, basic, easy questions. And if you feel like you're being trapped, usually when I do this with the live audience, yes, you feel like you're being trapped, and the answer is too easy. So yes, if you're singing the 50 Nifty song in your head, so 50 Nifty United States with 13 original colonies, you are correct. So I imagine most people got that right. But to illustrate a little bit of invisibility, my next 2 questions are, how many federally recognized Native nations are there in the United States? How many federally recognized Native nations are in the United States? And how many federally recognized Native nations are in your state or region? And so there'll be a delay, and I won't necessarily be able to see everybody, but feel free to put those answers in the chat. How many federally recognized Native nations are in the United States? And how many federally recognized Native nations are in your state or region? So people who do work with federal governments tend to know these answers a little bit better. But I bring these up because I gave this presentation, I asked these questions to audiences of all kinds. And so I asked it to kids in elementary school, and I asked it to teachers and adults working out in the field in various professions. And typically people have an easy time answering the first 2 questions, but they start to struggle or maybe even feel embarrassed with the second 2 questions. So why? Why do people feel embarrassed, or why do people tend to not know the second 2 questions? Well, research has shown to many people we are extinct. Native people are extinct. We're a group of people that's stuck in history in a pre-1900 context, and we usually only exist in the present at photo op friendly powwows or culture fairs, because those are the moments where we look most like our sepia tone black and white ancestors that people most often see. Also, you have American Indian mascot imagery that focuses on a stuck in the past image, and our social studies. Several people are saying 574. All right, good. We got some federal people in here. So, but research has shown that 87% of all social studies standards in the United States tend to be about American Indians in a pre-1900 context. And so that's a really important piece, because basically most of what we learn about American Indians is not necessarily about American Indians in the present as active tribal governments, but people who are stuck in the past. And so in the spirit of this land acknowledgement, I would like everybody, considering we were going to be in person, but now we're virtual, I want to give everybody a moment to type in the chat about who are the indigenous people who reside on the land where you're at right now, and what tribal nations still currently reside in your state or region. So what is your land acknowledgement? So I want to give everybody a moment. Who are the indigenous people who resided on the land where you're at right now? And if you have to go Google it in the background, that is perfectly fine. and what tribal nations still currently reside in your state or region. So engaging in this, even if you're Googling in the background and you ended up on a Wikipedia page trying to figure it out, this is a really important process of kind of just making those tribal nations visible. And that's an important part of the land acknowledgement, the act of doing land acknowledgements. So as those answers come in through the chat, it's great to see kind of where everybody's at in the United States right now. And so that's always fun. But to continue, the practice of doing land acknowledgements is educational, but there are other reasons. So for starters, many indigenous worldviews are inherently tied to the land, and traditional customs and protocols when interacting with indigenous peoples call for visitors to let people know who they are and where they come from so they can better understand their relationship with you, particularly as a visitor. And if you ever attend a conference with indigenous peoples, you will often see all the presenters' tribal affiliations next to their name, so it is clear who they are, who they are representing, and where they are coming from. In a way, it's about recognizing our socially diverse environments and always being aware of your positionality. However, there are other reasons. Many people, even professionals with some of the most advanced degrees, tend to view colonialism as a thing of the past, something that happened long ago, and something that we need not concern ourselves with anymore. So, that we need not concern ourselves with anymore. Many indigenous scholars would strongly disagree. Colonialism is a system of conquest and erasure of indigenous peoples that was set in motion long ago and stays in motion today. For Native peoples, you can see it in our food systems, and we're surrounded by subtle reminders. So, as I said, I'm not an agricultural expert or food policy analyst, but one can drive from Kansas City west on the Great Plains towards Denver and the Rocky Mountains and see cattle ranches and feedlots divided into rectangular plots with fencing to mark those territorial boundaries. Those fences in the rectangular plots of land represent the division of indigenous lands and settler colonial histories of conquest. What is no longer present on that drive, except for a couple bison farms, are the bison herds that once roamed those grasslands. The result is that we live in a situation where beef becomes the standard and bison becomes an exotic relative, even though the bison are more indigenous to this area and inherently connected to our old food systems. So these subtle relics are significant to indigenous peoples, and they represent a calculated and intentional effort to erode indigenous lifeways for generations. My Osage ancestors relied on those herds for sustenance, and the routines and sociocultural ways of life were inherently connected to seasonal migrations out to the plains for those hunts, along with other forms of place-based agriculture. In other words, these lands weren't just sitting there waiting to be settled and developed, they were being cared for. And it was recognized that along with the sun and water, land allowed for life to exist, and therefore food and land were inherently connected to cultural and spiritual worldviews. But then we spent centuries, let's say the American government has spent centuries sending Native children to boarding schools to learn Eurocentric languages and agriculture, and they were forbidden to speak their own language. And this process of cultural erasure is still in motion today. Also, it's important to recognize that we haven't fully disappeared, and our Osage Nation in particular has reacquired thousands of acres of land, established a community garden, a meat processing plant, and engaged in other projects to protect our food security. That is what many in Indigenous studies would refer to as ongoing survivance, a phrase that points to our ongoing strategic decision-making within nations and communities. So for many, the ongoing process of erasure and cultural erosion are not readily apparent until pointed out to them. The act of engaging in ongoing land recognition forces us to acknowledge how we are part of this ongoing colonial process. Remembering that I work for Kansas State University, I work at an institution that prides itself as one of the oldest land-grant institutions in the United States. It was an ag school, and this university was established around the time of statehood in Kansas as a way to spread Eurocentric approaches to agriculture and settle the land, all while my ancestors were being removed to Oklahoma. So it's important that we acknowledge these histories and our entanglements within them, and these are the conversations we must have, even if they're difficult. So I want to invite you to go to a website, and so we're thinking about what tribes are historical to the area that you're at. I also want to point out the website landgrabu.org. It's called Land Grab Universities, and it has a full database on the history of land grant universities and you can specifically look at land-grant universities and look at the tribes' land that were taken to support the development of those universities, and how the universities still benefit from those tribes today. And so if you get a moment, go to landgrabu.org/universities, and there's a whole database. So you can go explore, you can search by state, and you can go look at the history, background, amount of money, and exactly where land parcels were taken from Native tribes and given to these land grant universities to set up their the foundation for their university. So I'll give everybody a moment to do that, and I'm hoping that the website is being sent to everybody in the chat. So landgrabu.org/universities. And that'll give you something to do while we kind of conclude this portion and move to the next and make a transition. So to conclude, this is not to say that everyone who has white settler ancestors should apologize. This is the process of acknowledging how we are surrounded by symbols of colonialism and land dispossession. And in our modern context, we often don't take the time to acknowledge that what these symbols represent to Indigenous peoples. In other words, the act of land acknowledgement makes Indigenous peoples more visible and recognizes that we are not unattached to these histories. We're all entangled with them, and that the systems of colonial put in motion long ago are still very active today, and we have to engage in those conversations. So I appreciate the opportunity to share this acknowledgement and my perspectives, and waving off to the conference organizers. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you for the history and the reasons for why it's important to know who our ancestors and about the history of Native Americans.
And with these words, we declare the Power of Food Forum open.
Thanks, Noel. So with this, we're gonna move to our plenary. And I have the pleasure of introducing Samina Raja. Dr. Samina Raja is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning and the Associate Dean for Research and Inclusive Excellence at the University at Buffalo in New York. Dr. Raja's research focuses on people-led planning and policy in creating equitable, healthful, and sustainable food systems. She is an exception in academia and urban planning in her championing of the wisdom and expertise of community food advocates. She was part of the steering committee that guided the formation of the Buffalo and Erie County Food Policy Council. She will be facilitating our open plenary of the forum, looking back, planning for the role of racially equitable policy in transforming food systems. And with that, Samina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you both for getting us started. Welcome, everybody. I am delighted to be here to join in this conversation, and I will begin by acknowledging that I sit on the lands of the Iroquois Nation here in New York State. The session today is an incredible opportunity to reflect on the structures that are responsible for our food system, structures that sometimes are not visible to us. And this conference and this, not a conference, conversation is an opportunity to peel those structures away so that we can understand how policy can be more ethical, more equitable. This particular session is about what does it mean to build a healthy and equitable and a sustainable food system? How does policy at city, county, federal, state level, and tribal government, how can they facilitate and inhibit solutions? Collectively, with the guests that I will introduce shortly, we will reflect on how race and class have intersected and shaped food and farm policy in the United States. You will hear about panelists' values. They will reflect on how power has shaped food policy. They'll provide rich examples from their professional lives, their experiences, and help us navigate and think through where the movement and political landscape stands today and where they see opportunities for the future. So in a nutshell, 3 objectives for the conversation. And as I go through them, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll tackle how discriminatory policies have shaped the current food system at various levels of government. We'll share stories of how and why policy work can change those food systems. and then finally highlight opportunities for creating racially equitable policy change in the United States. To do this, who better than the guests that we have today? I'm delighted to introduce 4 colleagues from across the United States who bring a wealth of information and experience to us, and I will introduce them by order of their last names. And it gives me great pleasure to first introduce Shantell Bingham, trained in interdisciplinary education, both global development studies and public health from the University of Virginia. Shantell works to cultivate equitable strategies from the ground up in local and regional food systems on the East Coast through grassroots community organizing, policy councils, and political education. She has served on steering committees for Virginia Department of Agriculture and Community Services, built food justice coalitions in Charlottesville, Virginia, and worked regionally as a member of the Chesapeake Food Shed Network's Community Ownership Empowerment and Prosperity Action Team. In 2018, Shantell was appointed to the Human Rights Commission in Charlottesville, where she served 2 terms as chair guiding their work. She is a 2018 Muhammad Ali Humanitarian Award nominee and a 2019 Charlottesville Top 10 Under 40 recipient. She's a winner of numerous fellowships. She notes that she's a great-granddaughter to North Carolina tobacco sharecroppers. She believes every human is endowed with the right to self-determination in our food system. I'm personally delighted to invite her because I know that she has committed herself to ensuring that others too can work on pursuing that liberation. Welcome, Shantell. My next guest, our panelist today, is Denisa Livingston. Denisa, I hope will correct me if I mispronounce this, is part of the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance. Did I get that right, Denisa? Okay. Also trained in public health, she too is an unapologetic food justice organizer, Slow Food International Indigenous Counselor of the Global North, and an appointed member of the Champions Network of the United Nations Food Systems Summit. Her mission is to improve and empower the lives of others. She's committed to addressing food apartheid, nutritional trauma, the diabetes epidemic, the dominant culture of unhealthy foods, and the increasing need of healthy food access and restorative justice in communities. She has been a legislative speaker and community health advocate for the Diné Community Advocacy Alliance. DCAA, as it is called, has been globally recognized for its policy work, including passage of laws that address, in fact, food apartheid, and I suspect we'll hear about that today. She is the co-chair of the advisory board of Slow Food Indigenous Peoples International Network, a member of a national sugar action group, and has served as an advisory member of the groundbreaking initiative Reclaiming Native Truth, a project to dispel America's myths and misconceptions. She is also one of the contributors of the newly published anthology, Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting Environments, and Regaining Health. So grateful to have your presence here and join us in this conversation. Our third guest is Rhonda Perry, who is with the Missouri Rural Crisis Center. Rhonda is a 5th-generation livestock and grain farmer from Howard County, Missouri. She is the executive director of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, a statewide farm and rural membership organization founded in 1985. MRCC, as it is called, organizes their members in the fight for independent family farms, vibrant rural communities, conservation of natural resources, social and economic justice, and a safe, affordable, high-quality food supply. MRCC's mission is to preserve family farms, promote stewardship of the land and environmental integrity, and strive for economic and social justice by building unity and mutual understanding among diverse groups, both rural and urban. I'm delighted, especially because I happen to know that she was one of the people recognized by the Community Food Security Coalition nationally for her work, long before food systems work was popular in the United States. Welcome, Rhonda. Last but not the least, Dr. Damien Thompson is the Sustainable Food Systems Specialization Lead in the Masters of the Environment Graduate Program at the University of Colorado Boulder. In addition to his training and teaching in anthropology, he holds a certification in permaculture design and advanced permaculture design and a teaching certification from the Yoga Alliance. There are musical instruments in his background, so I guess there are more talent than his bio lets on. He's a farmer and a designer of biodiverse food-producing landscapes. In 2018, he co-founded Frontline Farming, a Denver-based BIPOC and women-led farming not-for-profit organization whose mission is to create equity across the food system, to support and create greater leadership and access for women and people of color in our food systems. As an activist, public intellectual, and researcher, Dr. Thompson's interests are wide-ranging. He has taught and spoken about food justice, permaculture design, small-scale urban food production, community food systems, and racial equity, all topics that I'm certain he will touch on today. He's interested in how communities can use traditional and modern information and practices to build food systems. He centers racial equity as a key organizing principle in his work, and I suspect that we will learn a lot from using that principle in advancing this conversation today. Welcome, all of you. Really honored to have you here. So we have a full agenda and a very short time. And I suspect that people are already thinking about all of you and sending in questions to our colleagues. I'm going to start with some general questions for all of you. I have, of course, shared some preliminary information about who you are, but each of you has a story to tell. So tell us, please, in your own words, who are you? What brought you to food systems policy work? Come to that question as you wish. Share with us what fundamental values shape your commitment, drive your work. I'm going to start with Shantell. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Samina. It's amazing to be here this evening. I'm joining you from unceded Muskogee territory. Thank you, Dr. Redcorn, for your land acknowledgement. And for those of you who don't know, aka Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Shantell Bingham. I am originally from Goldsboro, North Carolina. I am the great-granddaughter of tobacco sharecroppers, and a lot of my introduction into the food system, I would say, started at a very early age. So when I was about 5 years old, I have a very distinct memory of my mama take me out to my great-great-grandmother's house, which still had expansive tobacco fields behind it, and picking tobacco because that's what she did as a child. A lot of sharecropper families were like that. And so my mom wanted to introduce me to that work as well. And so that's really in my DNA. Once, I got to age of 14, I wanted a scholarship to go to a boarding school. And then I ended up going to the University of Virginia. Well, I can say that I met Joy Johnson, who is an amazing community organizer and social justice activist from public housing. And Tamara Wright is another mother that I met in doing my work. And during my time at UVA, I actually ended up starting an organization called Growing for Change, where we were working with public housing residents to co-design gardens. And that journey really taught me that there's so much about our space that's political and politicized. Residents couldn't do anything, something as simple as growing in their front yards. They didn't have access to water because the Housing Authority had removed the outside water handles, so they couldn't turn on their water from the outside. And so it was just this whole long, I think, domino effect of exploring housing, public housing policy. And what does it mean for someone to have rights to grow their own food? The underbelly of food apartheid for me, as you will. And then from there, ended up working at City Schoolyard Garden, and which is now Cultivate Charlottesville, leading the Food Justice Network, which is about 30 organizations, as well as over, I would say, 200, 300 community members, individuals that are aligned behind our local movement to make an equitable and just food system in Charlottesville, Virginia. So I'm so excited to be here. In terms of the fundamentals that really underpin my work, I'll share one quote from Ella Josephine Baker. And she says, in order to see where we are going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must understand where we have been. And I think this opening plenary, looking back and planning forward, really speaks to that. Not only being able to remember and see history, but to understand history, to understand the root causes of food inequities, of food apartheid. And then, once you get that understanding, start to work to reverse engineer it through policy and through programs and through community mobilization. And so I'll end it with that core fundamental is to understand that history and always work from a center of racial equity and anti-racism. Thank you.
It's a great place to start us off with. I'm going to turn to Damien with the same question, if you don't mind, Damien.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with this dynamic panel of professionals and individuals. As Samina indicated, my name is Dr. Damien Thompson. I'm speaking to you from Denver, Colorado, which is recognized as Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho territory. Also, as she also indicated, a co-founder of Frontline Farming, which is a Denver-based Black and Brown-led direct action and advocacy farming nonprofit, which engages along a spectrum of issues from food access to food justice to food sovereignty. I'm also a member of the Denver Sustainable Food Policy Council and a co-convener of Project Protect Food Systems Workers, which is a collective of organizations, activists, and individuals meant to advocate and support legislative movement in support of our food systems workers. And also during the pandemic, Project Protect Food Systems was successful in standing up Project Protect Promotor Network, which is a network of community leaders who are outreaching to and supporting agricultural workers with PPE and other protective gear and clothing, as well as addressing the dire food security needs that exist among farm workers in many of our rural communities. My work in food policy, I really think, is about triangulation. Food policy is an intersection that has come into greater focus with experience for me. Personally, I come from farming people, both ancient and in the not so distant past. Both my maternal and paternal grandparents moved from South Carolina, where they worked as sharecroppers, to North Carolina in search of better opportunities. And despite systems of racial oppression, my maternal great-grandfather was able to purchase through a white benefactor, 100 acres of land where he and my great-grandmother raised 3 generations of our family. Of that 100 acres, we own none today. And that wealth and connection has been lost in a generation. My personal connection to this work is also connected to land loss and the recognition that the loss of Black land was achieved through both violent but also legal means, achieved by way of policy and legislation. So you have things like Jim Crow policies, obviously, which allowed for separate treatment of whites, also into the modern day where we're still dealing with issues of eminent domain and gentrification. Mm-hmm. So these policies aren't abstractions, they aren't abstract things, they impact people in real, significant and serious ways. And so they must be changed, they must be addressed. With Frontline, we say that our policy work is our food justice work, and that this is because we are working within the system, within the system as it is, and it currently is rooted and given sanction in law and policy. So as Black and brown farmers, we from a variety of backgrounds, we advocate for all farmers, recognizing that Black and brown farmers face specific historically rooted challenges to farming as a livelihood and to land ownership. And so I know that there is a lot of other things to say, and we will continue the conversation, but I will close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Turning to you, Rhonda, share with us, if you will, what brought you to food systems policy work.
Wow, first of all, I'm just grateful to be on a panel with such incredible people. These are great stories about our history and how we all personally come to this work. I came to this work in the 80s. As you said, Samina, I'm a 5th generation family farmer from Missouri. Our organization started in the 80s in the midst of the farm crisis, and my parents were actively engaging in Missouri Rural Crisis Center. They were actually founding members of the organization. I've been here 30 years now, so I guess we sort of have a thing going on how we're engaging in the food system. In the 80s, as some of you will recall, it was a time, in some ways sort of not so dissimilar to now, when there was a lot going on, illegal farm foreclosures, hundreds of thousands of acres of farms being illegally foreclosed on and ending up in the hands of corporations and insurance companies. And farmers were organizing and fighting back. And my parents were part of that, and they were one of those farms that was potentially being foreclosed on. And one of the things that happened in that kind of environment, that sense of scarcity when people are going to lose things, is there are always those folks out there who want to blame someone, who, like people like the Posse Comitatus, who were in rural communities organizing diligently to try to say, we know who's to blame, and it's people who aren't like us. And Missouri Rural Crisis Center came about in that environment, in which we knew we had to be about something that wasn't about hate and something about blame, but something about hope and how we could come together and demand justice, not just around agriculture and the food system, but about all the issues that are keeping us down. And it was an incredible time for my family and for the organization. And I think we've really stuck with our values of knowing that we as farmers could not win justice in isolation from the rest of society. And that was sort of our motto of how we went about organizing white rural farmers in the Midwest during that time. MRCC works on federal policy, state policy, community policy, where we literally challenge the corporate agriculture system of food and create sustainable alternatives. So we have been involved in local food. I sort of laugh because we didn't even call it local food back in the early 90s when we started our Patchwork Family Farms livestock marketing project that still exists and is thriving today. But we came to sort of a way of organizing that is about sort of 3 basic principles. One, we organize on the issues that rural people care about, what keeps us up at night, the things that are specifically impacting people's lives, from factory farms, clean water, clean air, rural health care, and corporate control. Secondly, I specifically identify and intentionally identify excessive corporate power as a real issue, and lift up pro-democracy narratives of everyone is in, no one is out. And that means a lot of things, from making decisions at the local community level. And thirdly, we are specific and intentional about racial justice and our work within our own primarily white organization in rural Missouri, and our work with our allies in our state, which we can talk a little bit more about. But I think recognizing that this current corporate food system and the concentration and vertical integration of food keeps so many people down, no matter where we are in the food system, whether we're the farmer in the Midwest, or the worker in the packing plant, or the fast food workers in Kansas City, or the consumers. We all have a lot at stake here, and Missouri Rural Crisis Center and myself are looking very forward to working with you all.
Thank you, Rhonda, for sharing that perspective. Would love to hear a response to the same question from you, Denisa. So just for everybody who hasn't been thinking about this, what brought you to food systems policy work? What fundamental values shape your commitment to policy work?
Thank you, Ahihat. Just like to introduce myself in my Diné language. Yad Shikedo Shidane Shee Denisa Livingston and Nishya Kitlachitni Nishan Tishidane and Bushichin Oze Dane Tachitni Dashache Don Honest Edge Tachitni Dashanella. I see that Nasha A Tedagon will yet the Nishila. So just introduce myself in my precious Diné language. I'm here in Dinetka, in my homelands. I'm from the Diné Nation, the Navajo Nation, and reside here in New Mexico. And I'm from the Red House People Clan, and this is who I am. I've been really, pressured and also guided by my ancestors to be where I am now, knowing that my grandma and those before that came before her are sitting with me here and are surrounding the work that we've been doing. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and thank you to Dr. Redcorn for the acknowledgement of our people and our land and the importance of it. The work that I've been doing is really being a co-resistor in the work and disrupting the oppressive institutions and systemic systems that we have grown up in. I've been doing this work since I can remember. I remember being in conversations and at our Navajo chapters, being in the activities of the resistance against what has happened with our people. My grandfather died from direct contamination of uranium when the U.S. government hired our own Diné people to mine uranium during the Cold War era. And through the pandemic, we have seen many elders pass because they face that nutritional trauma. They face the lack of access to the medicine and the healthcare and the lack of access to healthy food. And this work has continued throughout my life, and not knowing the importance of it, of being a good ancestor and knowing that constant learning is essential in how we do our work. And in our work, really bringing energy to the work of nutritional trauma and addressing that, as our Diné people were sent on a long walk and given salt, sugar, and flour. We talk about where these foods come from and where were they introduced into our culture. And we didn't even have those words to describe when we were doing our policy work to describe those foods. And we had to come up with the community, the words of Ian Bijol, the oppressive, the prison food, the unhealthy food, the contaminated food, the foods that do not belong in our food systems. And it has been a continual work of addressing Ian Bijol, but at the same time, really bringing light to Ian which is food is medicine. And we know that we've been acknowledging that the solution is in our problem, and knowing that as we face and continually talk about reconciliation, reparation, and restoration, it's with the collective activities of our community members and bridging that connection and innovation, the social innovators that are in our communities, to government, to policy work, but also to the ancestral justice work that we are doing. And so I'm really glad and thankful to be here and also to represent those that have been a part of this work and continue to be a part of the work, not only locally, but intertribally and also internationally, as we speak about Indigenous peoples' food systems being a game-changing solution in itself, as we've been advocating for this with the United Nations Food Systems Summit over the past year. and seeing the challenges and difficulty about the transparency and also the need to support not the narrative, but also the lived experiences as expertise in our food systems, but also just the knowledge and ancestral wisdom that exists that we cannot find in textbooks. And so we are doing so many different aspects of important, relevant work with the youth all the way to the elders. And I'm really thankful to be here.
Thank you for sharing that. As all of you were talking, I was collating words that were coming out from all of you. And our audience can't see this, but my guests here are continuing to chat with each other. So I'm going to transmit this out back into our community that is listening. All of you touched on values of remembrance, of justice, of equity, of ancestors, of collective action, of organizing, of democracy, of all in, of justice, equity over and over again. And I just have to observe, as somebody who lives in the policy world, that this is not typically how people approach policy work. So thank you for reminding us what values ought to be surfaced whenever we talk about policy. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. And you all touched on housing policy, you touched on federal policy. So there are some shifts happening societally in the United States. And if you could share with us, what are some shifts that your organization is considering? How are philanthropic or federal government commitments to racial equity influencing your shifts, policy shifts, if at all? If you are not seeing change coming from philanthropic organizations or from the federal government, please share that as well. But what are you seeing that's happening at the national landscape, and how is it showing up in your work? Maybe I'll start with Rhonda this time.
Thanks, Samina. I think as our organization, with a 35-year history of sort of doing the work that we do, but with also care about the history of racial justice and injustice and what that means to us as white farmers, we really entered 2021 in a place of like new urgency about the opportunities to build real power. And we took on a lot of sort of new things. We had historically sort of thought about racial justice and injustice as part of all of our work. And this year we decided to do like two significant things based on the crossroads that we are at in our country, both in terms of food, but also in terms of the many issues around race that are going on and the dialogues happening. We really put ourselves in a position of how we are going to organize our leaders to be set to take this issue on. And we created a program called our Crossroads Justice Project. And it is all about how do we help both engage and listen to stories of everybody within the food system, and then help tell those stories. How do we better understand and elevate racial justice as part of our history in agriculture and as white farmers? Identifying and setting goals that we hear from our allies and that are coming from our communities, and how do we build work together? And the building work together part actually happens in a couple of ways. And one, which is a really exciting one that we're doing with our allies in Missouri, called Missouri Organizing Voter Engagement. And we are building a powerful engagement for policy in which we're trying to engage 1.6 million people in our state. And that is in urban, rural, in all areas and all communities of our state. And I think that has been a powerful forum for us, because we know we didn't get here accidentally. We got here because of policy, and people make those policies and people can unmake those policies. And this is our chance to really build a grounded voter engagement piece of work. And we are creating tools that let us know and discuss and think about how race and class have been systemically manipulated by those with power to keep us separated. And what are the actions that we will take to make sure that we are no longer separated, and we're building power in our state between white farmers and urban folks in St. Louis and Black farmers in the Boot Heel. And it's a really exciting time for us in Missouri and stepping up to these challenges. So I think that's some of the changes. I would say I'm not sure of the changes that are coming from the federal government or philanthropy, but I think we're just about moving forward. And hopefully those changes will come as we build the power and demonstrate what is possible in places like rural Missouri.
Thank you. Damien, what are you seeing?
It's tough. I don't know whether to go from my script or to go from the notes I've been writing down. I think I'll kind of try to bounce in between. I think this is an interesting question, and it kind of depends on, your perspective and where you sit. And as someone who sits at the intersection of several different institutions, it takes me a minute to kind of position myself in the right way, but really focusing on things from the perspective of the work that we've done with frontline farming, especially over the course of this past 18 to 20 months with the pandemic, and really thinking about values, and really becoming aware of how important it is to not only walk in our values, but to also to recognize the values alignment with partners is really, really important. So the way that I'm kind of thinking about it is, rather than talking about the shifts within our organization, kind of thinking about what shifts our organization represents. Thinking that we represent the shift in that people do make decisions. I think that what Rhonda just said, there are people making decisions related to policy. And we need to build organizations that sometimes in order to represent ourselves from the places that we stand as community members. I think we have to build new organizations that begin with building a culture and values that are representative of who we are in culture and as people. And so Rhonda again spoke about real power, and how we build it. And so really investing our effort into building powerful institutions from the ground up, starting with culture, I think is really important. Part of that is using values as a baseline for the development of the organization. And also it should inform the type of work that your organization takes on. When we can work in alignment with our organizational values, then there is no confusion on where we stand or how we work. And so I think the issue then is one of who is most appropriate to work with. And so I think that, again, with frontline farming, we recognize that it's dangerous to assume anything about other people or organizations based on the fact that we're all seated around a table to take on similar concerns. We learn that it's important to discuss values at the beginning of working with other organizations and individuals. We also learn that just because someone says they have values, that those values may not necessarily be in alignment with our own. And that can impact everything from who is doing the work to what values are tacitly accepted and perpetuated because they haven't been critically examined. I think another way of saying this is within our organization, we are catalysts for shifting values because we are upfront with our own, and we are upfront with our desire to have our values in alignment with others. And I think the last thing I wanted to say is that when we are in groups or in coalitions, we want to assume that all of our values are aligned, and that can be a dangerous proposition. We want to assume that everyone in that space has the same positive values, but we know from mathematics or arithmetic that some values can be negative. They can subtract from the whole. So we also have to create space in our conversations and deliberations about negative values or values that have a negative social impact. Profit is the type of value that leads to all sorts of externalities and creates inequities between communities that can have devastating effects.
Thanks for sharing that. I think historically that some of the demands for positive value in policy has come from community. So calls for civil rights, calls for environmental justice came up from the community and demanded some federal policy shifts. And in some ways, I'm seeing that again, and certainly reflected in Rhonda and your comments. Denisa, what about you?
Thank you. In our work, we're really looking at the polycentricity, the agency, and recognizing the autonomy of Indigenous nations across the world, and creating hopefully a process or even the discussion about how important it is to engage in the trust conversations and the trust exchanges, the trust investments that should be happening. And what we've been really advocating for is also to look at reciprocity. As we've seen in the past, many organizers and organizations and even the federal government coming to our communities and telling us what solutions that we need, instead of asking communities what solutions that they are engaging in or what solutions that they have. I think there's a lot of question on introspection and looking at, why we're doing the work that we're doing and why do we need to do it a certain way, or even implement different ways to be able to not only accommodate, but to support the current work that is being done in communities. And so as we think about the restoration and knowing that we are the organizers to transfer the work to the future generations of being transformative, and knowing that the transformative planning, and also knowing that everyone is a change maker, that everyone has a seat at the table. And in our work, in our grassroots work, writing a policy, the Unhealthy Foods Tax, the Healthy Designation Act, where community members were able to engage and write the policy, was something that we fought, many years. It's been almost 10 years now that we've been doing this work, but really trying to implement and knowing that community oversight, community engagements, the frequency, and also the intensity of how we engage with community members to be able to plug them in is critical. And so we've had more during the pandemic to be advisors and also to be consultants to look at policy work at the federal level. And we've been also engaged in creating curriculum with the Praxis Project on disaster justice. We are stepping into a new work of looking at rural futures. And as we think about this also, I think the really critical thing is thinking about how we're automating inequalities. When we look at AI and that impact that it's going to make, especially when there's not enough data that is true, speaking the truth about our communities, and how AI is going to influence that, and the biases of algorithms that is going to compute solutions that are not important for our work. And so as we think about this from, the local level to the federal to the international level, I think we should be thinking about how this influences our food systems, but also the indigenous food systems, because that ultimately reflects and will influence our indigenous public health systems that we need to build the work on. And so we think about data sovereignty and the importance of it, and recognize, like you said, the agency in this critical work. I believe it's important, as we think about the collective continuance from our communities, but also from the elders, our ancestors, and looking at the collective protection about how we're doing our work and going forward and doing this important work, knowing that we have to weave in the contributions of the youth and contributions of those that do not have an official title, do not have a formal education, but looking at the ancestral knowledge that we need. So it's really important as we're having these conversations right now and looking at policy work, looking at building a framework on how we review policies and how, this oversight is happening, but the lack of oversight too, because someone is always going to speak for us when we're not there, and we have to ensure that we are there at the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Denisa. Shantell, we're going to close this question with you.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, I have to go last now. But I do appreciate the rotation in panelists. I would say, big picture, we have a food system that values exploitation. It values capitalism, it uses and weaponizes racism to really determine who is going to be at the bottom of that rung? Who are we going to exploit, and what lands are we going to exploit? What lands are we going to take away, and how are we going to move resources around? And so when we talk about like fundamental value shifts, our community, the Food Justice Network, Cultivate Charlottesville, we are coming from community ownership principles. You know, what does it look like to build community power from the ground up? I think the Food Justice Network, we started as and you know, me just being frank and candid about it, we started as a predominantly white formation. There are a lot of organizational nonprofit leaders within Charlottesville. And just because of, you know, how our community, you know, was over time, like who has that power to, you know, sit as in an executive director position of a nonprofit, most of the people that when we started our formation, it was largely white. And so a lot of the values that we took to that work was saying, you know, how do we really take what we have, the agency of the individuals that we have and the organizations that we have, and really start walking the talk of racial equity and anti-racism. And so years ago, we really started to build our community food justice program, our community advocate space, creating actual positions for people to work in organizations, right? Because we're all here, we're all getting paid for this work. And yet we're going to community members in that same kind of exploitative way and saying, extractive way, and saying, volunteer your time to give us your, you know, expertise on your lived experience and help us craft policy. And so we took a step back and we said, no, the people that we want to volunteer their expertise and knowledge need to be in our organizations. And so that's where Cultivate Charlottesville started. And how we, you know, continue to build. I will say our coalition now, our mobilization is multicultural. And so now we're working on how do you build this movement and relationships across like race and class and age. You know, you have someone who's a single working mom of 5 children sitting at the same table with a 16-year-old in high school, sitting at the same table from, you know, a white nonprofit director, and managing that power and coming up with policies together. And so a lot of that fundamental shift, I would say our values were always there, but it was the practicing of it that's always so hard. And when it comes to, you know, our local government and those different institutions that we were working with, I would say that, you know, we were putting pressure on them for a very, very long time to do this work, to see, you know, that there's a food inequity problem, there's a food apartheid problem in Charlottesville, Virginia. We were doing that work of trying to turn their lens or open their eyes and turning their lens. And so now that there's a lot of, you know, more government agencies and philanthropic organizations leaning into it, it's like, awesome. I'm glad you arrived with us. And now us kind of turning and figuring out how do we really work, because we already know as an organization that went through it, it's not enough for these, you know, federal entities or institutions to say, we're doing racial equity work. You know, practicing that and living it is so different. And it's hard and it can be challenging, but, you know, that's some of the work that we're doing and have been doing for, you know, about a decade or so now. Thank you.
I was really struck by all of your references in some of the earlier questions about history. And then I asked you this question about shifts in your institutions. It's a little bit unfair because we're not asking the federal government, what are the shifts you are making? And as an urban planner, I happen to know that in the last 10 to 20 years, cities across the United States have started adopting urban agriculture ordinances and laws and regulations, in some ways catching up. But because they don't address, Shantell, your suggestion that we need to understand history, in some ways, policy even today perpetuates the same problem that it did 20 years ago, or it did. So a good idea like urban ag can become a tool for gentrification because people are not paying attention to the value shifts that all 4 of you described so well in the context of your own work. So I was just thinking about the dissonance between the shifts that you are pointing to and where the world is. So that's the setting for the next question, which is helping our community that is dialed in to think about where we need to go. So what are 3 shifts that you would point to that we must engage in, either people or organizations or institutions, if we are going to seriously transform food systems and move towards a practice of racial equity? You could talk about culture, you could talk about structure, you could talk about relationships, whichever you choose. Damien, if I may, I'm going to start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It's a great question. I think that with regards to people, it's really important. And I think that this is kind of across the spectrum, but to recognize that it is a spectrum of experience that we're speaking to, but really to understand and face up to our cultural upbringing, right? Being honest about how much of our upbringing, especially folks who were raised here in the United States, is rooted in white supremacy, whether we be on the benefiting end of white supremacy or on the not beneficial end of white supremacy. It's important, even as we think about how we build organizations, how we engage with counterparts who may not be Black, who may not be people of color, and how to work through processes of like decolonization, even as we try to build our own organization. So I think that there's certainly a set of cultural shifts that need to happen, and I think that the facing up to white supremacy is a core one. I think that understanding structures gives access to some while denying access to others is a really important piece, right? So people need to understand that there are certain structures that deny access to people of things like land, of resources, of water, right? As we've talked about with history. Like I said, understanding that those structures are historically, they're historical, but they also have current iterations. So with hunger, that means that you have to grapple with the nature of hunger, and also the reality. And in Colorado, we're still at 33% food insecurity, dealing with the fact that is still an outcome of certain historical dynamics. So I think structurally, as people, we need to kind of recognize that is what exists. I think that organizationally speaking, from a cultural perspective, we need to understand that diversity and equity must be baked into the cake, so to speak. And so I think it's as Shantell was just kind of mentioning what it takes to turn an organization or an entity that's not rooted or doesn't have its foundations in equity, in diversity, that isn't represented in terms of like its leadership with diversity, with equity at the heart. And then I think also with structures and organizations, to the extent that we can, we really need to work on flattening out our hierarchies. We need to shift to structures that promote and support participation. And then I think also in terms of thinking about relationships, when we're thinking about community, really being asset-based as organizations and recognizing that community members are assets, not only for volunteering, but also for work. And so we build ourselves and our kind of financial sustainability so that we can create opportunities to leverage community, but also in a way that's supporting them, that's paying them a salary, that's providing them insurance and all of the really critical things that we know people need on a day-to-day basis to survive. So those are some of the shifts and changes that I think we could probably start to attend to.
Thanks for all of those. What about you, Denisa?
Thank you for that. I think it's really important for us as we think about re-educating and reprogramming our tongues, and that's based on the pallets, the plates, the planting, what we're putting on, our plants, what we're planting, and also what we're eating, and also how we're speaking about the foods, and also knowing that the resistance is how we are reprogramming our planning as community organizers. Our climate change is getting better at organizing. And it's really important to see this because our tongues should be programmed for liberation. And that is including indigenous languages. It is including our first languages. It is including the ultimate way that we speak beyond this, and even including our spiritualities. Many times we leave that out of the conversations, and as indigenous peoples are very much tied to the land and the earth, and also the spiritualities that exist and continue to guide and lead us. We hear about a lot of the ancestral prophecies. I think we need to be listening to those, especially as we have the solutions for climate change as indigenous peoples, and looking at what our communities have been able to do to reprogram and also re-educate ourselves about this important work. And the other thing is just knowing that seed sovereignty and biodiversity is very critical, and how we are creating our organizations, looking at how we're growing our food, and knowing that this corn that I just grew this year, and knowing that our children and the future generations need to know how to produce this corn, how to grow this, and what it takes to grow the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, the relationships that connect in the work that we're doing, because they speak to us too. They speak to us on how we do the work, and how we should be doing the work with one another. And just like our brother Damien talked about, having procurements with a purpose, thinking about how we're moving from marginalization all the way to community ownership, and looking at that process too, on how we're being inclusive and diverse, and knowing that these are the really critical priorities that we should be putting forth about what we're doing in our fields. Are we getting our hands dirty, or how are we helping people to connect to the food? Social gastronomy is really connecting, to who we were, who we are, and where we're coming from, and knowing that that connection is critical in the solutions that we create going forward. And so as we think about this, and thinking about our planet animal relatives, and knowing that, it's those conversations that we're having, without technology, knowing that, when we're talking to grandma and grandpa, and knowing that when we're having the relationship with the corn, is knowing that, what comes out of that relationship also heavily influences the way that we organize ourselves. And I think about, the data sovereignty with seed sovereignty, and also the biodiversity that needs to exist in these ways to be able to influence the indigenous public health system, but also in BIPOC communities, that we're all dealing with our health issues. We're all dealing with food issues. We're all dealing with a way to create solutions, and how do we organize, with the adaptability that our ancestors mastered. I believe that they mastered that, the resiliency. We're learning how to do it just now. And, how are we doing that together, and how do we need to do that together is really important, because as an act of, practice of freedom is learning how to love. There's one of our sisters, our indigenous chef sisters, Loretta Oden, she said, what if we treat one another the way that we treat our food? And if we intentionally know how we treat our food and grow our food, and how we have that relationship, imagine how we can create the healing frameworks, the healing centered frameworks, to be able to make the impact in our communities. And so it's really important as we think about that relationship of food, and also the gastronomy that exists all around us. Thank you.
Thanks, Denisa. Shantell, 3 shifts. What's on your mind?
Denisa and Damien really are hitting a lot of the things I had written down. Damien talked about community members, our assets, and hiring the people that you are looking to get expertise and things from, and not requiring them to volunteer their time and their knowledge. And so I'm going to talk about some other points I had written down before. And most of this is like for institutions. The biggest thing I can say is move the money. And by move the money, I mean really looking at having a fundamental shift in grant making. A lot of organizations, grassroots organizations, frontline Black and Brown, BIPOC organizations, Indigenous organizations have been ready and are ready for this work. And there is always the issue of getting funding. And then when you go to get funding, being able to walk the talk of that funder or that granting institution, that is a huge barrier to us really just shifting a lot of the work. So I think there needs to be, a massive fundamental shift in how, a lot of our institutions grant monies. I know the Biden administration is trying a little bit with the Justice 40, and there's some work that's being done there, but there's so much more that we still have to do in the work ahead. And then just like for the individuals, I think folks are starting to learn about all of the BIPOC leaders that are in this movement that have been hidden figures for a very long time, and have been talking and running, the food apartheid work, the food justice work, the food sovereignty work. And I think now it's a time, like if you're an individual sitting here and you're listening and you are really thinking about like, how can I continue to push myself? I would really highly suggest like going and starting to follow the works of a lot of these BIPOC leaders. Shout out to Castanea Fellowship. You can go to their website. There's tons of grassroots leaders that are doing this work. Folks like Navina Khanna, Duran Chavez out of Richmond, Malik Yakini, Dara Cooper, so many folks that are doing this work, and we need to continue to follow their leadership and learn how to do that well. Because, a lot of this stuff is not going to continue to change in a sustainable way, not just for the moment, but in a sustainable way if we don't continue to uplift and support the leadership, and then also, move that money where it needs to go.
Great suggestions, Shantell. I'm going to turn to Rhonda. 3 shifts. You can take it in any direction you want. People, organizations, institutions. How do we move towards racial equity?
It's really not surprising, I guess, how much similarity there is in our views. I think for us as an organization, one of the things we think is important is that we acknowledge that people who are engaged in food acknowledge the role and the impact of corporate power and what that means, and how that corporate power and corporate control of the food system impacts all of us, because it relies on the exploitation of family farmers, of the environment, of rural communities, of workers at all levels of the food system. And we think a lot about things like the pork industry, because that's what we work in. And what we see is in one generation, 90% of the hog farmers were pushed out of business. 2 corporations, Smithfield from China and JBS from Brazil, control half of the entire pork industry. Consumer prices during the same generation have gone up 125%. And we're like, well, does this matter to us, for people who are about local food and are about growing our food? And I think sometimes we think, well, we're disengaging from that corporate economy and the work that we're doing in local food. But I think we can't afford to do that, both morally and because those are some of the same entities who are writing the policies with their paid lobbyists that work against us every step of the way, whether it is about the issues we care about on Black farmers and land ownership, or whether it's the things we care about in stopping factory farms and promoting local food systems. Also, I think this COVID demonstrated the power they have when they were able to jack up prices to consumers for meat for inordinate amounts of money, while paying producers smaller amounts of money than in a very long time, and forcing workers to come back to work in an unsafe work environment. Like, we can't afford that kind of power working against us. So our ability to acknowledge that and challenge that while we're building something new and better, I think is critical. The other 2 things that have been mentioned actually already is we need to listen versus tell more in the communities that we work in. And this applies to us as organizations, but to also, politicians and elected officials and people who should be listening to what people are saying they really need, versus saying the policies that we're going to do and then sort of tangentially being like, right, those are the policies you need. And we've been doing a lot of that in something we're calling transformational conversations in rural America. Obviously, we ran into some issues with COVID in terms of a lot of those conversations are best had in person and in the community. So we've learned a lot of new skills, but I think those best happen in person, and we'll be glad to get back to those conversations where people tell us what they really think and what they need. And then lastly, the role of resources. And I think our ability to have resources that enable us to try things as it relates to justice for everyone in the food system, and it lets us take what we just heard in those communities and implement them versus here's the things you can do with these resources, when maybe what we found out in those communities is that doesn't work and it's not going to work. This is what we really need. So our ability to really organize money, because power is organized people and organized money. So hopefully we will make an impact on folks who are resourcing this incredible work.
Thank you for sharing all of that. The question of resources came up in several of the comments, and I'm struck by the observation that food work and food policy work in the United States is a pretty small portion of all the expenditures that government makes. And in addition to ensuring that resources are distributed in fair ways, I also think that collectively the food justice movement has to claim resources away from other policy areas. At the moment, I'm struck by how public safety or policing is a bigger portion of local government budgets than food. And why is that? So we just have to change that conversation, and you gave us lots of ways to think about that. I'm going to shift gears and talk about some barriers and challenges. And I'm going to go back to Rhonda and ask you, what are some systemic barriers that exist for equitable and just structures that we've been talking about and practices? How do you undo those barriers? How do you build and then sustain those best practices? If you could speak to that.
Wow, back to back. I'm actually going to totally change what I was thinking about saying on this, because what I just heard from this conversation that we just had really makes me think about how do we build the power to transform the food system and what it looks like and who's in power and who's in control. And typically, I mean, at least historically, who has been in control are folks who are not in communities of color or even in rural areas of our country. And part of it is because we aren't able to play in all of the arenas of power that some of the others are, like our opposition and people who want to not fund or put money into food systems and growing food systems because that isn't sexy. So they have other ideas. And so we sort of look at organizing power and like three faces of power, which is in the form of like immediate political gains, like the campaigns we run, the policy work that we do, the legal actions we take, I mean, the direct actions that we do that give us immediate policy gains. We got to do a lot more than what our opposition has to do to get those gains. But we also have to work in the field that we call building organizational capacity and infrastructure that is based on the communities in which we work and that represent the communities in which we work. And that's like base building, our leadership development, even our strategic alliances, coalitions, and collaborations, and organized money. And thirdly, our ability to impact the narrative. Like there's a dominant narrative out there that we have to counter all the time, which is that this corporate system is more efficient. It's better for consumers. It gives us cheap food. It's better for everyone. It's inevitable. And I think our ability to continue to and build and transform that dominant narrative into being a narrative that is about what we want the food system to look like. And we all know there is plenty of money in the food system. Right now, there are just a few players who want to have all the money. And we know that there's plenty of money to be made for workers and family farmers and even consumers in the system, but we have to create a narrative that demands it. So I think our ability to play in all three of those arenas of immediate political gains, building organizational capacity, and transforming the dominant narrative is something that we think we sort of haven't, it's a challenge that we have, but it feels like we're moving in the right direction, and conversations like this are helping us move forward.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot, back-to-back questions. I'm gonna stay with the barriers because we often talk about, successes and don't get into the things that are sometimes difficult. Damien, the question is next for you. If you could share what barriers exist for equitable and just organizational or institutional culture, which you actually touched on earlier. What are those barriers? How does one undo those barriers? And then how does one build and sustain an equitable and just culture?
Thank you very much. Really another great question, and I got really excited listening to Rhonda's response. Without getting too far into the weeds, I think she did a really excellent job of hitting on many of the most important points, especially thinking about power, capacity, immediate gains, and changing the narrative. I really appreciated those contributions. I was going to take a little bit of a different tact and really thinking about some of the rooms and some of the conversations that I've been in over the past little bit, and thinking that one of the first barriers that is often unrecognized is the fundamental lack of clarity around what equity and justice actually are. And so, as an example, in a meeting right at the beginning of the pandemic, a group of stakeholders who had come together, including frontline farming, to really discuss like what should we do in the aftermath or in the midst of this pandemic. We have hunger, we have food insecurity at the highest levels, we have markets that are collapsing, we have supply chains that are not functioning properly for a variety of reasons, some of which Rhonda also hit on, and really understanding, and we were debating the proper role of equity and how we were being called to respond to COVID. And so in this case, I think we were talking about emergency funding of producers, and someone brought up that even though we were discussing equity for marginalized stakeholders, largely marginalized stakeholders, in this case, small and medium-sized farmers, that we should also comment. The comment was also made that we needed to be fair, somehow fair to large producers. And so I think it's really, I was kind of struck by that. And so, my comment at that time, and I continue to stand by this, is that fairness and equity are not necessarily the same thing. Equity means from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, whereas fairness means even-handedness or impartiality. And so my argument at the time was that why were we being forced in a moment of crisis to deal or to respond to the situation with fairness, with the entire system that we were sitting here hoping to address has been historically based on truly inhumane and unfair treatment of people, land, and animals. And so what is equitable for me, based on my subjectivity as the great grandson of South Carolina sharecroppers, may not necessarily be what's fair to a landowner who's had that land and has been white, say, for 100 years. So I think at least I hope, and we did see it continue as our work continued, that those concerns about equity versus fairness were able to be allayed, because as we were actually creating funds or raising funds, we were able to allocate more than 50% of those funds to new farmers, to small and medium-sized farmers, to veteran farmers, to BIPOC farmers, to women farmers. And so we saw through their comments, they really appreciated being seen and not necessarily being treated, quote unquote, fairly, having their unique needs responded to And that really helped to ease some of the anxiety and economic hardship that people were experiencing. So I think that those two words and how we kind of have a tendency to bandy them about really can become problematic and be a huge barrier. And there's more to say about institutionalized racism also, obviously. But I think that I'm going to take a step back and see if we can get into that part of the conversation in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Damien. The lack of clarity around language, I think, is one of the reasons that allows structures to persist the way that they have. So thanks for drawing attention to that. I'm going to turn to Denisa next, and we are getting close to the end of the time for the panel, and I want to save time for Q&A. So Denisa, a question for you is, what are some relational challenges that you have observed? And then what are some bright spots that you have seen that allows us to navigate towards equitable and just policy work?
Thank you for that question and for this discussion in this space. Really thinking about the transformative change for community members and the journey that needs to be transformative for them as well. The journey has to be liberating, and that includes helping our allies to learn to be an accomplice and also to be a co-resistor. It's important, how we build our relationships. And this is really critical in this time and age that we're in right now, with the resurgence of all of the important justice work that is being done in Indian country, but across the world. And as we look at the healing that needs to happen in our communities, we can't have health without the healing. Really acknowledging that grief, the trauma, the pain from the perpetual, continual pre-existing conditions, even before the pandemic. I think the pandemic has really highlighted those needs that we have already been in, and also been not being able to rest in, or even to heal in, and to think about how do we return to those conversations of what it is to have relationships. And so we've been advocating, to be in consultation, to find ways to intervene in the local level, all the way to the national, all the way to the international level, about how we are also credited our contributions, because as we look at research and evaluation capitalists, the data ethics, that we have been questioning, that we need consent at every level. And that's part of, relationship building, knowing that we need to stop taking advantage, and those need to stop taking advantage of our broken tribal systems, and also the lack of enforced protocols that happen in our communities. And so as we think about the relationship and the community currencies that need to be acknowledged, the time, the talent, the skill, the expertise that our community members have, it's important to know that they are very much a part of that process. And the transfer of power, quote unquote power, as we see power, we can't have autonomy without the power, and we can't have autonomy when our identities are not recognized. We have to be qualitatively different. And when we're thinking about this in public health systems and the food systems, it's important, that we need to be on purpose and negotiate more than we ever have, for equity, but also to look at social determinants of health equity, to look at the hope and the efficacy that needs to be considered in our communities with all the important work that we're doing. And so as we think about the citizen participation, we advocate for more of the community engagement that needs to happen to the local level. And that's going to take some work. It's going to take some time, but also knowing that, that time is also invested in the many generations ahead of us, knowing that we may have to start that work or even continue that work. And it's not going to happen overnight. But I think the persistence and the patience that we have been given is knowing that, we are, headed toward transformative change that can happen with the interventions that we are seeking, but also acknowledging of how this needs to happen. And so as I think about, the healing process of the work, to be in solidarity, it's not accidental. To be in health solidarity, that's intentional. And so really thinking about the intentionality and the interculturality of who we are and how we're doing our work is important, about how we come to solutions, but also strategies for a sustainable future. So it's a really important question. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak to that.
Thank you, Denisa. We are getting to the last question. There's a lot I'm digesting. I almost don't want to move forward, but there's the tyranny of time and the panel. So I'm going to turn to Shantell with the last question. Given everything that you have heard and all your own experience, we know collectively changing policy can be a big lift. How have you been able to build leverage to change policy, to influence it? You can speak to allies, grassroots mobilization, partnerships with anchor institutions. Tell us how you make magic.
Sure. Yeah, it definitely has been a magical time, and it flew for this panel. But for the Food Justice Network, I can share the story that, really got our local food appropriation bill, or, whatever we call it, the Food Equity Initiative, passed. And the start of our, shift or influence was really the narrative shift. And so when the Food Justice Network got together as a group and we started to mobilize, one of the things that kept coming up a lot was just like, what does food justice mean to us? What does our local narrative look like? And how was inequity like really built and enshrined into, our local food environments? And so we started with a white paper. A lot of the research that I did, and we really gave birth to, the political education and training of the Food Justice Network. And I will never forget the research that we looked into was, the redevelopment of our city, aka the destruction of Black communities, right? Historically Black communities, for the building of, the more developed area. We looked at, school integration and what that really meant for pulling on and tugging our community apart in a different way, and integrating it, back in a way that was always putting Black and Brown communities below, and also just completely changing their physical environments, housing redevelopment, school integration. A lot of these movement spaces and in the 70s really physically changed the environment of Charlottesville, Virginia. And we wrote a paper and we held our first roundtable. And I'll never forget that our first roundtable occurred on August 14th of 2017. So it was 3 days after alt-right rallies came to Charlottesville, Virginia. And we were in the room in the Jefferson School. It was about 50 people that had gathered for the launch of that paper. And one of those folks was Rebecca Schmidt, and she was a part of the Blue Ridge area, the Blue Ridge Health Department. And Rebecca had originally been tapped by a city councilor to present a proposal to our city council on shifting our food environment and food access, because food insecurity has been an issue in Charlottesville for a very, very long time, and it still continues to be an issue with, one in 8 non-residents have issues with food access. And so, that narrative shift in that paper, in the first roundtable discussion that we had, because of the circumstances that it took place under, everyone was ready to mobilize. And all we needed was that institution, which at that point was the health department, to give us our grassroots like formation, our mobilization, like a little bit more validity, in the eyes of city council, because they weren't looking at the Food Justice Network as like a legitimate policy council at the time, or a movement space at the time. And it really was our health department that took that first plunge. And we were able to pass that first food equity initiative in 2018. And after that, we continued to pass local appropriation bills. And it's enabled us to really bring together all parts of our community to draft policy and to redo our comprehensive plan and all the other great, amazing things.
Thanks for sharing that. I hope, certainly for me, but I hope for everybody who is on in the conversation today, it's becoming super clear that policy doesn't come out of a void, that there are starting points, there are advocates, there are allies, and you laid out lots of ways that maybe others are inspired to navigate the challenges as well. So with this wisdom that all of you have shared, people in the conversation who we can't see here, but they are dialed in, are throwing in questions that are coming as a result of your comments. And I'm going to start raising the questions from the audience at this point. And not surprisingly, some of them are about policy formation. And the first one is, how is being part of a food policy council helping you or not move towards acting on these goals and values? And if I may, I'd like Damien, if you don't mind starting with that. And I know Shantell, you could speak to that as well, but why don't we start with Damien?
All right. Much. Another great question. I think that a lot of the things that I've kind of enumerated or that I've spoken to today have been a part of just being in and participating in a food policy council. Participating in the food policy council really helped me to grapple with some of these, I don't want to say inconsistencies, but maybe contradictions. One of the contradictions that I kind of was originally struck by in dealing with or working with the food policy council is kind of like the professionalization of food policy and food policy councils themselves, really looking around the table. And this is a conversation that we actively engaged in. So I think it's important to kind of highlight that as well, that, this is a meeting that takes place at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, right? So everyone who was in that room, with the exception of maybe a few people who were there from the community, were essentially being compensated for being there, right? And so it's important too, when even as you're engaged in food policy councils and you're engaged in the act of trying to create progressive policy at the city level, for instance, in this case, still to recognize that contradiction, to recognize, because it informs who's not at the table. It informs who's not being represented, whose voice or culture or perspective or subjectivity isn't being dealt with. I think another thing that you may see in food policy councils that I think is interesting is that oftentimes it lacks producer voice, right, or a wide variety of producer voices. And so in any context, if you're having conversations about food policy, even if there are food policies that are created in central cities or in urban areas, those food policies are still going to have impacts on producers outside of the city. And so being able to understand how to engage with producers who are in urban areas or peri-urban areas or suburban areas and allow them to inform from that perspective policy, I think is really crucial. And then the last thing that I would say is really thinking about understanding what representation means and what a critical lack of representation, the impact that can have on conversations that are happening on the food policy council level. If you don't have various parts of the city, if you don't have various income brackets, if you don't have people with business backgrounds and different types of backgrounds, then you really have an opportunity to miss things and miss communities that can really benefit from the policy that can come out of food policy councils.
Thanks, Damien. Shantell, from where you sit, would you like to add anything about food policy councils? I suspect we have a lot of representatives from FECs.
I can be super quick because I know that we're short on time. The only thing I would add is, yes, I think food policy councils are really critical to moving change. I will say Charlottesville, Virginia is a place that has a lot of restaurants, and we're well known for our foodie scene. And so there's a real way in that food policy councils, just because they exist and they're there and they're operating, doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing, racial equity or work to undo, racism in our food system in terms of access or producing or, harvesting and things like that. So, if you're going to create a food policy council, I definitely think and do believe that there are ways in which you really do have to create a food policy council that has people experiencing, food insecurity, or are producers, like Damien had said, Black and Indigenous, hopefully, producers. And you're creating funding lines of funding revenue or funding stream, to pay people for being on that council.
Thank you. Not surprisingly, we have a question coming up about the Farm Bill. So the question from audience is, how is your organization getting ready to advocate for BIPOC farmers in the Farm Bill coming in 2023? What national policies are reflective of the racial equity values being spoken about today? Rhonda, would you like to take that one?
There is a lot to that question, so I'll try to just say, I think this will be the first farm bill since a global pandemic that laid bare like the fragility of this current food system and what it does to people and to land. And I think this will be an opportunity for us to take some of the things that are coming from the administration, some of the issues and the executive orders around concentration and competition and the corporatization and the power that these corporations have over the people in the food system who work every day as part of that system, and make that policy. So I think there are some things that are coming out of this administration related to this issue that I think we need to be both not just thinking of them as administrative orders, but how can we take those policies and make them into the issues that we want to see that address the issues that represent our communities. And I will say, I had a thing on my wall from a politician who does agriculture policy from years ago, when he said, you know what, people just didn't understand all the good policies that we were giving them. They just didn't get it. And you just want to say, I wrote stupid on it, and I've had hanging on my office wall for like 8 years. I'm like, because you weren't listening to what the people in those communities were saying. You were once again telling them the policies. So I think our ability, both in the food, in all of the arenas in which we work, our ability to have these conversations, both in our communities and with each other like we are now, to feed into and provide direction for this farm bill. I think people feel a sense of hope that we haven't had for a long time for lots of parts of the farm bill. But we know it's also going to take a lot of organizing and a lot of work and a lot of participating in those three faces of power to transform the power.
Yeah. And just like really quickly, Rhonda, I just wanted to add that there's a Justice for Black Farmers bill that had come out, and there was an intention to roll that into federal policy. And there's also, some cases that are being brought up by white farmers in terms of those bills and claims of discrimination. And so, my one call of request for, anyone out there is to just really be allies in this work. Justice for Black farmers or brown farmers or indigenous farmers does not mean like every other farmer is not going to get anything. It doesn't mean that like justice for someone else doesn't mean that you are going to be left on the side of the road, right? And so there are a number of organizations, the National Black Food Justice Alliance, Leah Penniman and Soulfire Farm. There are a number of entities that are leading that work, and just being able to plug into those streams are really extremely helpful, especially if you're allies in this space. And maybe support some of those farmers that are bringing up some issues about discrimination, and help them to understand that why this is not discrimination would be extremely helpful as allies in this space.
We are getting close to our end time, so I'm going to direct one question to Denisa. Colleagues are asking regarding grants for community organizations. They can be time-consuming and competitive. What do you see as opportunities for change, and how that work is funded? Throw into that also, how can investors help change oppressive food policies? And then I'm afraid we have to close with that.
Those are some big questions to be answered so quickly. I think a comment to the question before, support the Native American Seeds Protection Act. That is one, bill that we need to support in going forward in addressing food sovereignty. The other things too is that the Healthy Donation Act, the unhealthy foods tax revenue that we've created, study that, get to know how communities can be creative in creating revenue, recycling this negative energy into something that is positive for communities. From the unhealthy food tax, we're the only indigenous nation, also the only community in the U.S. That has an unhealthy foods tax. We've been able to generate, millions of dollars and fund over 1,000 community wellness projects so that there is not that competition of communities trying to get the grant work because, only 3% of, funding goes to indigenous communities. So it's already not, a place that we need to compete, with each other to try to get funding. We need to create ways so that our communities are creating revenue and allowing our community members to be entrepreneurs, to be able to, have something that we're not just having our hand out all the time and saying, how can I get this, but how can we grow this? And how can we generate, this for our communities? And so the Healthy Donation Act has been a prime example of that, because that was the one situation where communities did not have the capacity or even the skills or even a computer or even Wi-Fi, to apply for a grant or, to have, the tools to be able to do that, competitively. And yet we created the revenue so that that revenue stream is going back to communities to do what they need to do. And to build the systems, that they, create for themselves, to have the solutions for them. And so it's really important. Funders, I always tell them, go and visit communities, go build a relationship, don't look from afar, go and see what is happening, because the news doesn't tell the narratives. The news only, shows a part of who we are, but really, what is happening during the pandemic, what is going on, like what are the issues, how is community doing, go and visit. There's no other way to really understand the dynamics of, what communities are doing, but also what they're living through, and also just seeing, the oppression or repression or the continued oppression, that happens and is continually happening, because we don't see that enough in the media. And I think this is why Reclaiming Native Truth, the project that we worked on is so critical, that Dr. Redcorn addressed. So lots of different things, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Denisa. That's a powerful way to end our panel, and I'm going to hand it to our hosts, Noel and Karen. Thank you all very much for being in conversation.
Thank you so much, Samina, Denisa, Shantell, Damien, and Rhonda, for the beautiful analysis of our histories and legacies. Thank you for showing how we must engage in equity and justice-centered policy work, and how that informs the transformation of our communities for the children that are yet to be born. Truly appreciate you all.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I also wanted to give a thank you to Noel and to Marcus Hill for helping us to design the questions for this panel, for such a great conversation about power and values and community. The words are very inspiring. I wanted to say one brief note about tomorrow. We hope that you will stay tuned tomorrow. Join us at 11 a.m. Eastern for Building Together to kick off the next day. And then engage in conversations, learn from other food policy councils. The time tomorrow is meant to build relationships, to come together and to share with one another. And then stay tuned for our second plenary in the evening about power from people to policy. We have a great panel set up. And after that, you can get your groove on with music from the Ward Family Jazz Band that'll be playing live. So thank you all, and good night.